now I would like to officially open this online presentation, and we are here to discuss Imperio Forum Confessional Loyalty and National Indifference. My name is Irina Paert, and our moderator today is Andrey Shishkov. Andrey, hello.
Hello, Irina. My name is Andrey Shishkov. I'm a research fellow of the School of Theology at the University of Tartu, and I'm a theologian, and I will be a moderator of today's meeting. Today's discussion is about the publication of a special forum on confessional loyalty and national indifference in the second issue of Imperio journal for this year. And we will talk about those communities and religious groups that define themselves not through nationality, but primarily through their religiosity. And we are talking about people who in imperial and post-imperial time lived in frontier areas and were minorities rather than the mainstream. It seems that study of minorities and frontiers reveals much about the mainstream other and big other that confronts them. But why does this topic also turn out to be relevant today? One of the forum's editors, Irina Paert, wrote in her Facebook post announcing today's discussion yesterday. She wrote, "Today, when the flags are being changed in the central squares of occupied and then liberated cities, talking of national indifference seems to be irrelevant, and yet it is often during the times when the national borders are redrawn and the national flags are changed, indifference is brought into question. What does it mean to belong? What to do about those who either do not want to belong or are perceived as such?" And today we will attempt to answer this question as well as pose other questions that will be answered in the future. Our meeting today will be structured as follows. First, I will give the floor for forum editors for Irina Paert, Lilia Berezhna, and Catherine Gibson, who will talk about this project for 5-7 minutes each other, maybe. Then we will give the floor for 3 forum authors, Darius Stalunas, James Kapala, and James White. Each of them will have 10 or 15 minutes for a short presentation, and then we will be able to ask questions and discuss topics of interest, and also we will record our discussion, and we will decide with everyone involved whether or not to post it online. First, I would like to give a floor to Irina Paert, who is an associate professor at the School of Theology and Religious Studies of University of Tartu and the leader of the research project Orthodoxy as Solidarity, supported by the Estonian Research Council. Irina, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Andrey, for your introduction. So I would like to say a few words about how I came about to be interested in the topic of this forum. So, and just very briefly about our project, which Andrey has mentioned. So the research project here in Tartu, well, in Estonia, is called Orthodoxy as Solidarity, an examination of popular and conciliar orthodoxy in the Baltic provinces and independent Estonia in the long 20th century. So the project looks at a variety of conciliar practices that can be defined as a kind of horizontal practices between different actors, religious as well as non-religious actors, that kind of forming all kinds of solidarities across ethnic, geographical, and social divides. And in this project, we are interested in how these forms of horizontal solidarity are being formed and also challenged during historical events, breakdowns, such as wars, and also, under the influence of ideologies of nationalism as well as political oppression. So the concept of national indifference is one of the concepts used in this project, alongside with other notions of solidarity, conciliarity. And when I came across of the rich literature on national indifference that comes from the area of Habsburg Empire studies and the studies of the states that came in place of the Habsburg Empire. So I found that some of the questions posed by these historians are quite applicable to what we study here in Estonia, in the Baltic, because we are talking about different post-imperial states. And so in the framework of our project, we've been kind of asking ourselves questions how the multilingual Orthodox clergy, old believers, set to relate it in complex ways to the ideas about Estonian nationhood, and to what extent there was indifference to nationalism, and was it really a product of solidarity or not, and how did these forms of solidarity react, to various challenges and pressures of the 20th century. So these are like big questions, and we are only at the start of our project that is now being carried for less than 2 years. And the national indifference as a concept, of course, is much broader, and we thought that it would be interesting to explore it in the context of other countries, other geographical contexts. And with Catherine Gibson, we have started to look at different possibilities to collaborate with people, let's say, outside the Russian and the Baltic context. And there were 3 conference panels that we organized, 2 at ACES last year, 1 at Tartu conference. So we've written 1 article about religious indifference, which was published by Past and Present last year. And in December 21, we've launched this call for papers with Imperio. And the main idea was kind of to throw the net wide and to see, who is interested, as we are, in this kind of interplay between religion, confession, and national indifference. And the main well, the call for papers, of course, had many questions, and maybe not all of them were answered, but just to remind us what we were looking at. So we wanted people to think about the relationship between ethno-linguistic, national, and religious forms of personal and group identity, responses of religious minorities to nationalizing projects, attempts by church and state authorities to tackle religious ambivalence, hybridity, and those groups that were kind of going back and forth between different forms of identification. So we were interested in how confessional inter-ethnic solidarity was affected by transitions from empire to nation states, and in what ways did confessional networks and communities continued promote this kind of transnational and international solidarity, and in what contexts, these solidarities were broken. And more broadly, I think our big question was to what extent approaches from national indifference historiography are applicable to the study of religious groups, and what are the limitations of this approach. So we, as you know, I was coming mainly from the perspective of the study of religion, while Catherine came from the perspective of study of national indifference, and so we kind of tried to see whether this this would work and what insights, for example, scholars of religion could bring to the broader discussion of national indifference. But I think this particular area of historiography will be addressed later by Catherine. From my point of view, I would like to say that, well, since Andrey has started it, what I find today, for example, is that this concept of national indifference kind of continues to stir some kind of, well, on the one hand, interest, and on the other kind of all kinds of reactions, which can be often described as skeptical. And I think that's something we also came across when we edited this special issue in our discussions with the editors of Imperio. So we had to rethink our original thesis. And I think I'm going to leave it here, because what I started with is how our ideas came about and why we've started looking for authors for this forum. And now I would like to give the floor to our co-editor Lilia Berezhnaya, because she joined us in the very beginning of this project, and she can explain how she saw it from her perspective. So Lilia, or Andrey, would you say just a
Thank you,
word
Irina.
of introduction?
Yes, and I would like to talk about this framework and conceptualization of a special issue. I would like to give a floor to Lilia Berezhnaya, who is a visiting lecturer at the University of Münster in the Department of Eastern European History, and also visiting professor in the Central European University and the University of Leuven. Please, Lilia, the floor is yours.
Yeah, thank you, Andrey. So I hope my Zoom newly installed will keep broadcasting. So I would like to say that it was for me, for someone who is dealing recently mostly with the questions of religion and from the history of religion, seeing from a borderland perspective, it was extremely interesting and challenging, actually, agenda to go into these issues, theoretical, methodological, but also to look at sources describing the multiplicity of responses of population and religious communities in border regions, imperial border regions, in late modernity. As probably all three of us, the editors, we started with one presupposition and ended with multiplicity of responses to that, how to treat these issues. And in my 5 minutes here, I would like to bring a couple of theoretical insights into it, grouped according to research fields, let's say, and historiographical, methodological problems. One of it is highly debatable issue of confessional state. You know, probably all of you know that it was mostly coined by Robert Cruz in relation to the Russian Empire, and also in this context elaborated by Paul Weert as a concept of multi-confessional establishment. This issue has been also discussed in the general introduction of Imperio editors. Intensively discussed whether it can be applied to this issue of multiple responses of borderland population to the challenges of modernity or not. And they thought it is very promising to check it twice, whether it's possible or not. So both Paul Wiart and Robert Cruz made important contributions to studies of religious diversity in the Russian Empire by showing that despite the dominant position of Orthodoxy, non-Orthodox faith enjoyed a certain degree of autonomy and legitimate place in the realm of imperial social structure and governance. The multi-confessional landscape was characteristic of three, of course, continental empires, the Ottoman, Habsburg, and the Russian. And we also talk about the millet system, of course, in relation to the Ottoman Empire. For the Russian Empire, Paul Wiart termed this multi-confessional establishment a system that granted a series of significant collective rights to recognize religious groups and rendered the foreign confessions state religions entitled to certain forms of government patronage and protection. The system, however, came under challenge from modern ideas of religious freedom and rise in nationalism in the second half of the 19th century, but did not disappear forever. And in our context, and in context of this concept, we are dealing also, and we are reconsidering also the terms of nationalizing empire, and as well as nationalizing religion as a transfer process at the end of the 19th, beginning of the 20th century. And in this sense, confessions were often perceived in purely religious, not perceived in purely religious forms. Faith was understood not only as an individual concern, but also a communal matter. And thus, under some conditions, confessions could become political categories. Importantly, is that from this standpoint of the imperial government, all confessions had a degree of rights to self-government and various territorial and economic privileges. This didn't, however, apply those who challenge religious orthodoxy. Dissenters, old believers, for instance, sectarians, in relation to the Russian Empire, of course, religious reformists, and different mystics. The state provided the established confessions with instruments of control and banned heterodox minorities from access to legal privileges. I mentioned this issue of nationalizing empires, and this multi-confessional order also came into tension with this process of nationalizing empire. Confessions became reimagined in their relationship to the soul and body of the nation. The official ideology equated, for instance, orthodoxy with the monarchy and nationality, while the eyes of the Slavophiles, orthodoxy and commune were essential components of the Russian nation. And we have, of course, this equation with Pole and Roman Catholic, Russian and Orthodox, and so on and so forth. In this issue also, this is the first block. The second block, which we try to deal with, is this issue of national and confessional ambiguities and borderlands. Whether it's proper to use such terms, or we are talking about heterogeneity, or we are talking about hybridity of forms of interaction. This is the issue, which is within the framework of Borderlands studies. It's still now is not solved. It's highly debated. But anyway, we are dealing in this context with contact zones, which is characterized by dense inner interaction and multiple cultural practices and experiences. But these are also the zones of confrontation. Several articles in our forum deal with various efforts to communicate different confessional, national, and imperial ideas and projects, the interaction between these forms of communication and the longevity of such entanglements. And James Capello and James White both probably will discuss this in their presentations today. There is kind of, the issue of whether we can present these border zones, imperial border zones, as more a zone of interaction or confrontation, again, is a historiographical issue and question of presentation, and the zones in between. But what happened with the rise of nationalism, national ideologies, is of course the nationalization of borderlands, and the issue of minorities came forward. And in this form, this world order which existed there was challenged by these ideologies. And there were, this is our argument, different forms of reaction upon these challenges. One of the possible reactions to this attempt to force borderland people to decide between us and them, attempting to destroy multiple identities and loyalties, is, to our understanding, this issue of rejection and issue of withdrawal from decision. And whether we can delineate it or define it as in terms of national indifference is also a historiographical issue. And we provide in our introduction an overview of historiographical options within this term, as well as limitations, as Irina said. As you all know, this term has been coined and suggested by Zaratara and Peter Judson, and several other historians, mostly dealing with the situation in the Habsburg Empire. Historians of the Russian Empire, which is our focal point, have recently started to reflect on the impact of this national indifference historiography emerging from Habsburg studies in light of developments in their own field, leading to a rethinking of the relationship between empire and nationalism. This is, of course, within the framework of imperial term. Within this imperial term, the concept of national indifference has been met with some mixed reactions. For some, it didn't ring any bell, should we say. So there was no possibility to apply it to the history of the Russian Empire. Others have argued, however, that national indifference is helpful only in a more limited sense as a metaphor, to quote here Alexei Miller, rather than analytical category or concept. Miller argues that due to the different trajectory of nationalism in the Russian Empire, where the Tsarist government restricted the activities of mass cultural organizations for much longer than in the Habsburg Empire, national indifference in Imperial Russia manifested itself primarily as a political strategy among elite borderland groups in the Baltic provinces and Bessarabia, and some Polish-speaking nobility in the former Great Duchy of Lithuania, as well as, of course, his major topic, Little Russian nobility. We also aware from this about these reservations, the application of national indifference to the specific Russian imperial context. And this is also comes from the definition and historiography of national indifference itself, from those who initiated it. Quoting Zaratara herself, who argued that the term historically carries a pejorative connotation and was deployed as a negative and nationalist category by activists who referred to populations often constructed as backward and anti-modern. While we acknowledge these limitations, we believe that national indifference still has the potential to enrich our understanding of the Russian Empire and post-imperial regions, which are also in focus of our study. We regard national indifference as one of the possible reactions to policies of nationalizing empires, that have on the possible, that occurred on Borderlands since the mid-19th century. This concept is one of the ways to describe lack of mobilization rather than mobilization, as well as ambivalence or disregard of social actors toward nationalizing projects. We argue that rather than taking indifference as a fixed category or integral concept, we use it as a lens through which to examine practices, processes, and attitudes, and actions that otherwise might remain illegible to historians. We don't categorize populations in the category of the indifferent, as Irina said at the very beginning, and place in which confessional national loyalties manifested, but ask these questions such as how to deal with this issue. So it's more questions than answers. And this is the idea of our presentation today. We await your responses, we await your feedback, and it's more brainstorming than presenting. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Lilia, for this methodological introduction. And our third editor, Catherine Gibson, will talk about contributors and main findings. Catherine is a lecturer in East European and Eurasian Studies at the Johann Skytte Institute of Political Studies, University of Tartu, and the author of the book Geographies of Nationhood, Cartography, Science and Society in the Russian Imperial Baltic. Please, Catherine, the floor is yours.
Thank you, and it's great to see so many of you here today. So yes, I want to just briefly introduce the content of the forum and go through the contributors, as well as kind of try and synthesize what I see at least as some of the main kind of findings and contributions. So we have 5 articles in the forum, plus the introduction by the editors. And the 5 contributors all examine various popular responses by various religious and ethno-linguistic groups in borderland situations to various interventions that were imposed on them, either by churches, by the Russian Imperial administration, by state authorities, and also local authorities. And they use them as a way to examine interactions between confession and processes of nationalization in the second half of the 19th century and up to the mid-20th century. So chronologically speaking, the earliest contribution is by Thomas Marsden, his article, which looks at reactions to nationalizing processes among the Russian Empire's old believers, and uses this to argue about how this group and this concept of national indifference can be used to really think about how old believers test the limits of these various projects and ideas to forge a shared sense of Russianness. James White's article takes us to the Swedish-speaking island of Vormsi off the coast of the Baltic provinces, and presents a micro-history approach of how the islanders reacted to various attempts to convert them. And also navigated between these various confessional, national, and political loyalties. Darius Staliunas, again, then moves us south to look at tensions which erupted in the northwestern territory between parishioners, clergy, local authorities during a period of violent protests against the closure of Roman Catholic churches in the region. And then our final 2 contributors take us to the post-imperial period. So we have the contributions by James Kopalo and Juliana Sindrea-Nagy, which examine the continued salience of confession in interwar borderlands and the way in which religious minorities, in this case the groups known as Innocentists and Old Calendarists, how they lived in this kind of situation of uneasy kind of coexistence, and at other times actually outright resisted homogenizing and nationalizing efforts of the interwar Romanian government. So very briefly, just to kind of reflect on some of the bigger kind of themes and questions to emerge. And I completely agree with what Lilia just said about how I think as often is the case with special issues and forums, the kind of process of bringing together different articles and contributions is as much about raising further questions than actually answering and coming up with some sort of definitive kind of conclusions. So I would say that on the one hand, this forum builds on and is very much a kind of continuation in some ways of the historiography, which is now very developed on the Habsburg Empire and Central Europe, in the way that the contributors all reflect on both the possible applications and also the limitations of using national indifference as a concept. And perhaps this is also something we can discuss more about, you know, how useful is it as a concept, or is it a metaphor, as Alexei Miller called it? So what exactly is this term and how do we use it? And I think the contributors definitely do not apply a kind of uniform or homogeneous approach, but use it as a kind of tool to perhaps revisit sources or topics, and to kind of approach the sources in a critical way in order to generate new perspectives and questions on material. So, for example, of the contributors we have here, the articles by James White and James Capallo, I think very successfully use national indifference to kind of interrogate and interpret events against the grain of dominant Swedish and Romanian historiographies, and really show how this concept can be used to kind of give agency to populations who are often marginalized or misrepresented in these historiographies. On the other hand, Darius Staliunis, and I'm hoping he will also kind of address this a bit more when he talks about his article, is perhaps the most critical of the contributors that we had about the possible applications of this concept of national indifference. And I think his article does a really important job of pointing out that the absence of nationalist rhetoric doesn't necessarily equate to indifference. So I think it raises some really interesting methodological issues which are important to address. Focusing on confession, if we think about the kind of broader discussion about how we apply national indifference to the Russian imperial context, confession, I think, does a really important job of bringing us back to actually the roots of the Habsburg literature and discussion of this concept, which very much focuses on the kind of lower classes and bottom-up perspectives. This is in contrast to actually the several articles which have been previously published on national indifference in the Russian Empire. I'm thinking specifically of the special issue that was in Kritika with contributions by Alexei Miller, Karsten Bruggemann, Katja Wesel, and Andrey Shishkov, which very much approached it from an elite perspective. So I think if we're kind of looking about what historians of religion, so to speak, can contribute to these discussions, I think we can say that one of the perspectives we can bring is by refocusing this attention on the lower classes, on agency, and on these intersections between multiple loyalties, belongings, etc., at the level of the kind of lower class populations. Another main contribution of the forum is the strong emphasis placed on confessional minorities, various dissident groups. This was something quite striking in the response to the call for papers. And in the articles published in the forums, we have articles that look at old believers, independentists, old calendarists, as well as articles specifically on various confessional policies targeting Roman Catholics and Protestants in the Russian Empire's border regions. So I think this is something also that could be kind of used in the future and something that could be explored further. And finally, about the geographical scope of the forum. I think one of the insights that is brought is the value of thinking comparatively across different regions of the empire. And I personally was very struck by some of the kind of parallels that emerged between regions in the Baltic and in Bessarabia, Bukovina, these two kind of north and southern ends of the western part of the Russian Empire as these kind of axes of multi-confessional borderlands. And this is something I think which would be very kind of interesting to pursue further, both for historians of the Baltic and for historians working on Romania, Moldova, this region. At the same time, we are also aware of the kind of geographical limitations of the special issue. And we would have, at the outset, really liked to get some more contributions focusing on Central Asia, on the Caucasus, on Poland, Ukraine. But this is also the nature of putting together a special issue that it can never cover absolutely everything. But I think if we're talking about also where we would like to go with this in the future, or potential ways to build on this forum, expanding the geographical scope, I think would be a very fruitful direction. Thank you.
Thank you, Catherine. And we will follow further from this introductional part. We have here, and we are happy with it, 3 authors of this forum, and they will share their thoughts, findings, and maybe methodological problems and critique with us. And first will be Darius Staliūnas, who is a research fellow at the Institute for Lithuanian History and lecturer in the University of Vilnius. Also, he's well known as author of the book Enemies for a Day, about anti-Jewish violence in the Russian Empire. Please, Darius, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you for a kind introduction. Good afternoon to everyone. Let me start with thanking Irina, Catherine, and Lilia for organizing that special issue for Imperio, for organizing this discussion, and of course, for accepting my paper. My paper deals with so-called Kražiai massacre of 1893, when local Catholics self-organized to protect the closure of the Roman Catholic Church, but were violently driven away by Cossacks. So Kražiai is a small town in Samogitia, in western part of Lithuania, near the border of Russia, or later German Empire, and that was part of so-called northwestern region of the Russian Empire. That event became well known at that time, and thousands of newspaper articles all around the world. I found articles in the United States, in Scandinavia, in New Zealand, Australia, Japan, etc. Actually, all around the world, newspapers published information about this incident. And of course, Polish and Lithuanian intelligentsia was especially active in disseminating information about this incident. So it seemed to them that they were successful, but actually they failed. Their aim was to attract attention from the foreign rulers, and they failed. The only one who reacted to that incident was the Pope, who actually asked the Russian government for some explanation, but that was all that this, I called it propaganda campaign, achieved. At the same time, this event became a very important place of memory in Poland until World War II, and of course in Lithuania, and it's still very important. Actually, everyone knows about it, about the atrocities committed by the Tsarist government. And what is important for my research is that it was depicted by a kind of heroic act, not only as a religious, but also as national resistance. Of course, by Lithuanians against Russia. So in this article, I argued that local Catholics were mobilized by the collective concerns of religious community, and the defense of the church was detached in their minds from nationalist concerns. So what I argue in this article is that the concept of national indifference isn't helpful in this case, but it doesn't mean that I find it not useful in other cases. And by the way, I mean, now everybody talks about, I mean, the contribution by Tarazara and by other people who deal with the Habsburg Empire. But many decades ago, this topic was not maybe on that theoretical level, but was described and analyzed by some Polish and Lithuanian scholars who dealt with the issue of so-called local people, or tutejsi in Polish. I mean, in the kind of border zone between so-called Polish, Lithuanian, Belarusian ethnic territories. So in the end, it was, I mean, nothing new. On the other hand, there was a lot of literature on so-called krajovцы, on the movement or the small group of intelligentsia who refused to accept ethno-nationalism in the early 20th century. So many of these topics are not very new for the region that I am dealing with. But sometimes I think we are too quick to grasp and to use these modern concepts, and maybe we can explain things in a more simple way. So I think that church defenders felt a strong sense of belonging and solidarity with their Roman Catholic religious community, and regarded the Kraje church and prayer house as their collective property. What I'm saying is that collective identities are situational phenomena, and in this case, religious community was much more important than the national one. And it doesn't mean that these people were not thinking in national categories. It means just that in this case, they were acting as Catholics and not as Poles or Lithuanians. Secondly, I argue that peasants defending the church were monarchists. They believed in a good Tsar, and actually that belief was quite spread in the Lithuanian countryside in late 19th century. But at the same time, they were not naive monarchists, as some Marxist historians labeled them, or would label them. Many of their actions were driven by rational calculation, and they actually almost succeeded. Only contingency The change at the post of Governor General changed the situation not in their favor. Thus, the final point and the main argument, how one can explain the situation when monarchists turned into rebels. I argued that local society, grassroots people perceived the closure of their church, but also the violent actions of Tsarist officials in and around the prayer house as a violation of a kind of unwritten social contract that existed between them, the grassroots, and the Tsarist government, also that existed between them and religious authority. So the main argument of my paper is related with this concept of social contract that existed in the kind of Weltanschauung of grassroots. That's everything I wanted to contribute now. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Darius. We will move to the next speaker, James Alexander Kapalo, who is a senior lecturer at the University College of Cork in Ireland. And from 2016 to 2021, he was a principal investigator of the European Research Council project, Creative Agency and Religious Minorities, Hidden Galleries in the Secret Police Archives in Central and Eastern Europe. Please, James, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. And again, thank you to the editors for the invitation to join the special issue and for all their work in sort of getting us to question very closely some of the assertions or ideas that we were presenting. I was particularly delighted to find out about this initiative, about the forum, because it was a good opportunity to revisit some of the points that I'd kind of buried away in my monograph on Innocentism that came out in 2019. And actually following the publication of the monograph, an important work was published by Chris Davis on a national minority in Romania. The title of the book was Hungarian Religion, Romanian Blood. And in that, he approached the particular question of the state's role in trying to ascribe identities at the meeting place of religion and national identity, and also Andrei Shishkov's more recent work on the history of Bessarabia. So it was an opportunity to reassess what I'd already published in my monograph and kind of flesh that out a little bit more. So just for a few words about Innocentism for anyone here that has not come across the movement before. It was a movement that emerged in the kind of eastern part of what is today Ukraine and Moldova, right on the fault line, if you like, between the governorates of Kherson and Podolia and Bessarabia. But it became associated primarily with Moldovan or Romanian speakers in the province of Bessarabia, although, you know, ethnographic work today in Ukraine has demonstrated the vitality of the movement still in Ukraine rather than in Bessarabia. So I really was in my monograph, I was really trying to think beyond the category of the nation and test the experience of Innocentists against the kind of nation building attempts of Romania from the Romanian Center in Bucharest. And in this sense, you know, the Innocentist movement demonstrated or illustrated some powerful motivating factors behind the actions of ordinary peasants who'd been upheld as kind of ideal representatives of the Romanian state, as the kind of the cradle, if you like, of Romanianists, which had an ethno-linguistic base, but was also tied very strongly to ideas of orthodoxy. But very much in tune with the previous speaker, as I began to sort of look at those ideas, the critical point of attention came to actions. So what were the actual the kind of agency and motivating actions that groups were taking in response to a kind of nationalizing ideal or project. So Innocentism, like I say, it comes from this kind of borderland region, Orthodox in origin, but during the Russian Empire, there was no such thing as Innocentism. It was a, it was in the closing years of the empire. It was a movement associated with a pilgrimage and a charismatic leader. It wasn't a distinct religious tradition. It only became that really in the crucible of the early Bolshevik state and Greater Romania, the kind of Romanian nation. So when we think about it, we need to think about the kind of impact of both of those systems on the formation of what became an underground religious network. Which ostensibly, if you speak to Innocentists today, and if you look at the sources going right back to the 1920s, they maintained always that they were Orthodox rather than anything other than Orthodox. So the issue really is not about affiliation, religious affiliation, but actually about sentiment and commitment, motivating factors. And one of the most important points I make in the article, I think, is the relationship between historical time and sacred time, and particularly eschatology. For Innocentists who had a profound sense from their experience of the tumultuous years at the end of empire, that these were the end times, that they were living in the sort of the very culmination of the Christian sacred narrative. But actually, it's this an attentiveness to the precise details of the eschatology. What exactly were Innocentists saying about the end times, about the Tsar, and about their relationship to Romania in this regard? And I refer to it as a kind of existential eschatology, because the idea was that they were living actually in the end times, not prophesying, not looking forward to, but actually living and experiencing the end times, which assumed that the necessary actors, the necessary divine or saintly or angelic personalities were actually present in the present historical moment. Now, I think aside from this kind of attentiveness to eschatology that I talk about in the article, the other important sort of dimension, I think, that lies behind this really is how to get at a genuine history from below, how to capture subaltern voices and so on. And in the article, I refer to the Innocentists' own literary products, which are the life narratives, the Vita narrative of Innocenti himself and of other leaders, and also state security archives from the period, which are useful. So both sets are kind of underutilized when we think about historical studies. I come from an anthropological and folklore training into history, so I kind of have a familiarity with folk narrative research and kind of especially popular chapbook type publications from the period. So on the one hand, there's this useful set of resources, and on the other, the state security archives, which, because they're kind of archives from the sharp end of the interaction between the state and in this case a dissenting religious community, we get some very powerful but kind of rare glimpses, if you like, into the words and actions of the community. So in the article, I try and trace through the archives one case in particular of a group of Innocentists that resisted attempts to make them conform to an ascriptive form of orthodoxy that was prescribed by the state. And so I think the kind of methodologically, this is what the article offers really, is a way of using diverse kind of archival and kind of ethnographic and folklore sources to try and piece together an idea of time as perceived from the community in question. And so really that whole process I went through helped me, if you like, question some of the scholarship that's been produced by Charles King, but also Andrey Shishkov and so on, about how to understand the kind of failed nationalism of Moldova, or the failure of Moldova to accept the kind of the full-blown Romanian national narrative, which is still an ongoing kind of argument and fault line in contemporary scholarship on Moldova. So yeah, those are the points I wanted to make, I think. Thanks.
Thank you so much, James. And our third and last but not least speaker is James White, who is a research fellow at the School of Theology and Religious Studies at the University of Tartu, and a member of the research project Orthodoxy and Solidarity, and also an author of the book Unity in Faith about Единоверие, Russian Orthodoxy and all believers. Please, James, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, and I would like to repeat the thanks to the editors of the special issue, both for the invitation to participate and for the immense work they put in on our behalf with the journal, and indeed advertising the results of the journal and special issue afterwards. So I think I should begin with a brief bit of contextualization of my work, given that Vormsi, I'm sure, is not a familiar name to many of the participants here today. So Vormsi is the fourth largest island off the West Estonian coast. Today, it's largely known as a very sort of pleasant holiday retreat, populated by rather rich Estonian tourists owning holiday homes and so on and so forth, and cyclists. But in the late Imperial period, it was actually the home to a Swedish-speaking minority known as the Ibo folk, or the island people, who had been in the region since at least the 13th century. On Vormsi, about this period, there was roughly 2,600 to 3,000 of these people. The Swedish they spoke was a very distinctive dialect, indeed so distinctive that it could be difficult to understand for, let's say, high Swedish speakers. In this period, there was also about 100 or so Estonian-speaking migrants on the island, and a company of Imperial infantry. So just that context, the context of the location out of the way, the context of why I became interested. So as was mentioned, I'm working within Professor Irina Paert's projects at the University of Tartu on orthodoxy in the Baltic region, orthodoxy and conciliarity in the Baltic region. And what I'm sort of very much focusing on at the moment is to move away from sort of the broader political questions often asked, which are often the focus of studies on this period. So for instance, in the case of the Baltic Russification, and moving away to look at sort of the, I don't know, the religious lives of converts in this region, and trying to use this sort of immense archival depositories left to us by parish churches to sort of illuminate this. And of course, my interest was immediately piqued by the Orthodox conversion of Vormsi in 1886, simply because the incongruity of sort of a group of Swedish speakers converting to Orthodoxy, and why on earth this, and becoming interested in why on earth this took place. Just to give you a sort of very, and within Irina's project, I'm sort of heading a very small team of two other colleagues who are helping me, assisting me with research on this topic as it requires not only knowledge of Russian and German, but also of Estonian and Swedish as well. So they are my contributors. And in fact, we already published in 2020 an article about another Swedish group on the island of Rukno in the 1860s, where there was an attempt to convert to Orthodoxy. So that's one of the fruits of our sort of mini project. Just to give a sort of background to what happens within my article is, so in 1860, so we begin, as often the histories of modern Vormsi do, in 1861, when a group of these islanders went to Stockholm, presented a petition to the Swedish king, asking him to intervene on their behalf with the Russian emperor against the tyranny of, or what they call tyranny of, the Baltic German landlord who owned the island. This provoked a great amount of interest among the Swedish public. A great many articles and publications were released sort of claiming Vormsi to be this sort of lost tribe of the Swedish nation. And this in 1873 provoked the Swedish Evangelical Missionary Society in Stockholm to dispatch 2 missionaries to the region, one who was Lars Johan Esterblom, went to Vormsi itself, another went to the Swedish groups on the Estonian mainland, and then began a sort of evangelical mission to these Swedish-speaking people, the Ibo folk, which had both religious and sort of civilizational aspects to its discourse. Esterblom set up a school, sort of cooperated with the German landlord, but was opposed by the local Lutheran priest. And in fact, the Lutheran society, the previously homogeneous Lutheran society on Vormsi sort of shattered into different groups, some following Esterblom himself, others deciding to go towards a more, to go to baptism. And then in the context of the 1880s, following russification reforms in local governments and conversions on the mainland of the Estonian mainland to Orthodoxy of about 15,000 people from 1883 to 1887, some islanders also decided to convert to Orthodoxy. Around about 500 or so, and therefore adding even further to the mix. But it's also very clear that the conversion was motivated in part by a desire to bring in the Russian state's assistance from against the Baltic German landlord of the island, and also to help them in help their faction, if you like, in the complicated games of sort of peasant politics that were being played. And from about 1886 onwards, there begins a very distinctive attempt by the Russian Orthodox Church and also some provincial Russian state, Russian Imperial actors to sort of claim Vormsi as a part of the Russian Empire and as a Orthodox space. And I go into some detail into how they attempted to do this and why they ultimately failed. I think within my article, I think I've given a lot more on the sort of religious aspects of the special issues thematic, on this aspect of confessional or religious ambiguity, where the evidence is a lot clearer. On the question of national indifference and or the Imperial project, it's a bit harder to sort of evaluate the islanders' reactions, principally because, well, the islanders were mainly illiterate, were principally illiterate, and didn't write much themselves. Most of my sources come from Russian Imperial actors, the Swedish missionaries, the Orthodox actors, especially one of the Orthodox priests kept a diary that he wrote throughout the period from the late 1880s to 1917, really detailing on an everyday level what it was like to sort of, I don't know, construct this vision of Orthodox Imperial Vormsi. So I think my conclusions regard to the national indifference sort of side of this thematic issue are much more tentative, and probably still likely the material simply doesn't exist to go any further than what I've said.
James, your connection is breaking. Could you repeat? Could you repeat your last statement, because your connection was unstable? From your attitude to national indifference concept, maybe from. Oops. Yeah, I think we have technical problem here.
Maybe James can later in discussion repeat it somehow.
Yes, I apologize for my connection. It's been playing up all day. So where did you lose me? I'm sorry.
National indifference. Your attitude to national indifference.
I mean, I wasn't particularly going to talk about my attitude towards national indifference, but what we sort of in this article, what we've sort of aimed at is to challenge, is particularly to challenge the existing historiography, principally Swedish historiography on the island of Vormsi, where there has been a rather, generally speaking, not entirely speaking, but generally speaking, an uncritical adoption of the late 19th century perspective on Vormsi, which is to see, well, you know, these were lost brothers, lost kin, the lost tribe of our nation, sort of suffering under Russian imperial despotism, and rather to sort of, and consequently they ignore the conversion to Orthodoxy in the 1880s as simply, you know, yet another device or trick of the Tsarist regime to sort of, you know, distract these Swedes from their national roots, as it were. Whereas actually what we see in the evidence, which largely was inaccessible to Swedish scholars because it comes from the Estonian and Russian archives, is that in fact a lot of this conversion seems not to be so much directed from above, but rather from below, from the islanders themselves seeking to utilize the interest of the Russian state and the interest of the Russian Orthodox Church for their own purposes. And in this sense, we're also trying to expand what the modern historiography exists in English, which is much more focused on the post-revolutionary period of the what became known then as the Estonian Swedes. Whereas what we wanted to do was focus on this earlier period and try and complement this literature. So I think that's basically, I mean, if you want to know sort of my thoughts in more detail, I really recommend my article and hope you read it, or at least this brief introduction, hasn't put you off, I hope. But anyway, I think I will conclude there, and thank you again very much.
Thank you so much, James. And now we can start discussion and some words about rules. Please raise your hand virtually or physically if you would like to ask a question. And if you are talking for the first time, please tell us your name and affiliation. It is important for recording. And I would like to open this discussion. We heard already a lot of interesting issues and problems, as Lilia said, for brainstorming. And maybe somebody would like to be the first or to start this discussion. Yes, David, please.
Hello, my name is David Borchin. I'm a PhD student at the Lucian Blaga University of Sibiu, where I'm also a research assistant at the Institute for Interdisciplinary Studies and Research. I wish to thank you all for your wonderful and very exciting presentations. My question would be for Mr. James Capallo regarding the sources you used for your article. You mentioned that you had this approach between the state security apparatus and also ethnographic sources, if I understood correctly. Regarding the state security apparatus, my question would be which sources in particular you used for your research? Did you focus it mostly on the archives from the National Romanian Archives, which are available in Bucharest, or on the former archives of the Securitate, because they both contain important archives of the state that would be found in Bucharest. And on that note, I wish to ask if you've noticed in your research, if you focused on the hierarchical transfer of priorities and information from the highest level to the lowest level, particularly because I imagine that the Innocentist movement must have been differently perceived in the villages where it existed, in the towns where it existed, and then all the way up to the regional inspectorate of both the police and the gendarmes in Chișinău. And then it must have been also differently perceived, and the priorities must have been different at Bucharest at the level of the General Inspectorate of the Gendarmes, of the General Directory of the Police, as well as, of course, the Ministry of the Interior. If you could elaborate on that. Thank you very much.
Wonderful. Thank you very much. Very, very interesting question. But firstly, in relation to the sources, so I worked in Cenăsas in the State Security Archives, which, as you know, probably inherited a portion of the archives of the Siguranța from the interwar and wartime periods. So those files proved very, very helpful because they're summary files that deal with the Innocentist problem, and they've collected together a lot of material, but then was passed on to the Communist State Security, and then they went through their process of summarizing and reclassifying that material. But in addition to that, I worked in the National Archive. So as you say, going through the archives of the Gendarmerie in particular, but also the Ministry for Culture and so arts and religions, as it was at the time for most of that period. And then also the archives in Chișinău. So the National Archive in Chișinău, which contained actually some of the most important sources, which are the military tribunal files from the 3rd and 4th Army during the 1930s and 1940s, and those cases to do with Innocentists dissenters went through military courts. So that was a really important set of files. This question about the layers, this is really, really interesting and really important. And again, I give in the article, I think illustrates that a little bit, because it tracks the correspondence and the responses from the lowest level gendarme units in the village, and their lack of attentiveness to the job that they should have been doing, up to the kind of regional directorates, and then the directorate in Chișinău. So we have, I mean, it took a long time to recreate that trail, but between the kind of summary reports and then the few kind of individual reports that have survived, we can actually see how that correspondence was tracked and the kind of things that were important to relay kind of up and down the chain of command. But in relation to Innocentism, what's really interesting is that even though it seems like a very localized, kind of peripheral problem, it reached a very high profile in terms of the church journals at the time, and also was debated, by senators in the Romanian parliament. So it did really kind of have an impact from the grassroots right up to the top, and that's what's interesting. And the kind of back to the sources again, the kind of ethnographic side of things. There are communities today that follow on, keep this tradition, and they keep within those communities manuscripts and, of course, oral history and folk icons that have been passed down through the generations. And through those, you can track, if you like, the relationship between repression and cultural cultural production in the community, and from that we can extrapolate to what extent they were able to exercise their agency and in what ways they creatively kind of resisted the attempt to kind of homogenize the community and its kind of as Orthodox. I hope that answers the question.
Thank you. Somebody else? Maybe we can return to the problem which Lilia put and discuss this or not.
Which problem?
For brainstorming.
Brainstorming. Well, I mean, we all are invited to reflect on what's been said so far. I think, maybe, like for me, listening to our authors was quite enlightening in many respects, because one of the questions we wanted to discuss is, what next? How we're going to go beyond what we've outlined, in this forum, and how we can develop and just take it from there. And I think from what I hear is a really interesting, well, first of all, I'm convinced that comparative research, comparative inquiry, like what we did, between the Baltic borderlands and Romania, is very productive, because we can see similarities and differences, and also a certain threads. And what James Kapala was saying, I think, was quite important from the point of view of, like, yes, we are here discussing the agency and how we study the religious subject and religious actors as having agency of their own, not through the kind of eyes of these structures and systems that try to impose certain identities on them. So I think that, for me, is quite important, that we kind of find the language to understand. Well, methodology in the language, of course, it's coming from an anthropological perspective. It seems like a very normal thing to do, but for historians, often it is quite challenging, how to apply this anthropological lens. And I think I just want to suggest that it's often a question of documents and sources, as our guest David has just raised, like what kind of sources we use. And obviously, sources define the way we look at the subject. And we feel lucky we have sources coming from within the communities and ego documents, like biographies, autobiographies, letters. And I think these are, extremely important, and kind of to look at the subject, not just from a micro perspective, but even like from inside somehow, how a subject constructs, his or her own identity, both, personal and communal. Of course, we are not always able to deal with it. And of course, it's not also straightforward. But I think what, for me, a national indifference literature did, which was, of course, not only, but as well as other debates and discussions, is to kind of question the normality of having a national identity. So as if this is like just taken for granted, we all have it, and this is how it should be. And I think by kind of questioning it, we come up with some kind of interesting alternative ways to deal with it, even if we end up having certain, studying nationalists, we study them not as something that's just normal. Sorry. So I'm going to pass the floor to somebody else, because I can, get carried away.
I see James Kapalo would like to react.
Yeah, thanks. No, Irina, I think that's absolutely the crux crux of things that you got to there is that the way that we take it as natural that somebody will have a national identity, that one will have a national identity, and that will somehow be comprised of certain components. And I think from the presentations we've heard today, that you know, actually this attentiveness to what the kind of motivating factors for action in given situations can be used as a starting point for unpicking the assumptions that we have about a kind of essentialized or inescapable sense of national identity. And I think that's how, I mean, and we need to do the same in relation to religion as well, you know, Orthodoxy, Protestantism, Catholicism, you know, unpick them and look at the individual sort of motivating factors that are there, whether they're to do with salvation or whether they're to do with kind of existential need, but they are encased within an idea of religion or nation. So, you know, in relation to my own study and the work that I was kind of trying to be in dialogue with Chris Davis's book on the Moldavian Changos, you know, it really is a case of taking away all assumptions of being Catholic or being Orthodox, being Romanian or being Hungarian, and seeing, okay, what is it at the grassroots level that is driving people to motivating them to take action for or against a particular aspect of the state or for or against a particular aspect of the church. And it, you know, that attentiveness to kind of agency and creativity as well, I see it's one of the most important points. Will help us do that. Yeah. So yeah, that's.
Thank you. Irina?
No, I just want, we have really good specialists among us, so I would really like them to say something if if they feel like saying. Eugene, are you with us?
I sure am, yes.
Good to hear your voice. I'm sorry, it must be very, very early from where you are.
Yes, everyone in my house is asleep.
Okay. Well, it's good to have you. So I don't want to kind of put you on the spot, but it's just, yeah, kind of to if you want to react or to respond to what we are saying, yeah, you're very welcome.
Well, thank you very much. This is a wonderful forum, and I really I'm quite excited by the ideas that you're putting out there, and especially linking these kind of case studies to these broader questions about national indifference in the multi-confessional state. I think that's extremely valuable. So thank you very much. I'm quite excited by this special issue.
Irina, can I just say thank you to Eugene, because actually Eugene was one of the first people, I think, well, first English language publication on Inocentism. So he really kind of opened up the field for others to start to look at that particular religious community. So I think just thank you, Eugene, for having published that article way back when. Yeah.
Thank you for your wonderful book. I just there's so many. It opened up so much for me, and certainly I think your work in the secret police archives is just so remarkable. So thank you.
Oh, thank you in return. Thanks.
Well, it's good to have to give a space to people to express their gratitude. Yeah, and
but maybe someone would like to ask. Lilia,
Yes, just because I see also some participants here. Maybe first, well, coming from this Borderland perspective and a little bit from another research region, we have here. I'm just pushing beyond, as well as Ira did, to react. We have here Andrey Ivanov, who is doing also the Russian Imperial, about early modern stuff. Maybe you can comment on the issue. What are your reflections on this? And if not, then I probably provide with some what I think was the outcome of our volume and forum, and what might be a perspective. Andrey, are you here?
Yes, I'm here. Yeah, this is a very wonderful forum. I'm very happy to be here, and I'm just listening to great presentations, and the Borderlands, the National Indifference, the imperial contradictions. These, all these questions, all these issues were raised today. They were discussed, and I'm looking forward to Ab Imperio's volume. And reading that, and it's wonderful also to see Eugene Clay here. And I can't stop but think about the Western Front of the Eastern Church, and this is Barbara Skinner in her book that also had touched on many of the items, many of the themes and topics that were discussed here today. And so, yes, I work with a slightly different area, but also, Borderlands is obviously something that has been covered in my recent book, and the translatio, the transfer of knowledge, the transfer of ideas, west to east and then east back to west. So that's something that I have worked with as well. And I think this is a wonderful forum, and I'm looking forward to more discussions in this in this format. So it's wonderful. Thank you for the invitation that I got. Otherwise, I would know that this is happening today.
And may I just because Western Front of the Eastern Church. This is the book of Barbara Skinner, dealing with the 18th century subjects. But there, mostly her argument was connected with the process of confessionalization in the region. And this is also actually what was my initial idea, how to deal with this old stuff in the context of nationalized borderlands. So later a little bit, but still the same territories actually. I was coming with the idea, and we were intensively discussing all this in numerous Zoom meetings during pandemic, after pandemic, before pandemic with girls, whether we can, and it's also in their article in Past and Present, whether we can apply the terms which are actively used in religious studies of the region, as well as in borderland studies, as well as, for instance, in Islamic studies with Thomas Bauer here in University of Münster, whether we can find the terms of confessional ambiguity and maybe even confessional indifference to the description of groupness reaction upon the rise of nationalism and nationalized empires and national states. So this is the conjunction between traditional pre-modern, maybe, reactionary population borderlands. I wouldn't argue for confessional indifference. I would argue for confessional ambiguity, and the ways of confessional ambiguity, tolerance and intolerance in the history, which we observe. And this is again the term coined by Thomas Bauer. And then to see how these reactions were repeated, maybe, and somehow diversified with the rise of nationalism. So this was the original idea, whether this world of ambiguities persisted or ceased to exist, and when. One of my colleagues, David Frick, who is pre-modernist, who published several studies, volumes actually, on their early modern world of Vilnius, within the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. And later, as soon as he came to me and started by my invitation to give a talk about the 17th century Vilna and coexistence of different communities there, and it's not only interconfessional, it's interreligious and so on and so forth. One of my questions was, how long did it survive? What is his opinion? What is his experience in this? What is his idea about that? And he said till the end of the First World War. That's it. He's not an expert. Would we support this idea that this ambiguity world, hybridity world, oxymoron world, heterogeneity world existed just till the end of the First World War? And why? Or not, on this persistence, somehow we can could observe maybe later, maybe not. So this was one of the questions which still is in my mind, and this is of course the question of agency, as James Kapala said, and this is of course the issue of how ambiguities are related to each other, different forms, situational ambiguities, or how Philip Thier said this Zwang zur Eindeutigkeit, whether there were kind of resistance there, how it was grounded, and so on and so forth. So again, these are my questions upon questions. And it's worth providing comparison, as Irina said, to different areas. It's worth providing comparison between, of course, state policy in the same region, coming from different state entities, between different empires, and well, imperial and post-imperial, like what we see, what we have seen in Bessarabia, let's say, yeah, before and after the First World War, or where else, and it's still a multifaceted picture of Borderland, which inspires me in this issue. Yeah? And whether it has a long durée, which will be the end of ambiguity, or still it is there. Thank you.
Thank you. Please feel free to comment, to react. Yes, James, please.
Hi. Yeah, just responding to that last point there by Lilia, I think that's really, really helps us focus again. In some of my work, I talked about liminal forms of orthodoxy, which actually is that liminal space is where ambiguity can persist. And so, you know, if you apply that kind of anthropological view on liminal territories and spaces, if you want to be kind of concrete in terms of geography, but also kind of liminal, other liminal states, we can see how, you know, different circumstances allow for that ambiguity to persist. In fact, you know, that in liminal states, the possibilities just become exponentially bigger, where you have those conditions. So in relation to Orthodoxy, for example, where communities have managed to hover between different churches and different national churches, or between kind of being inside Orthodoxy or outside Orthodoxy, despite incredible pressures to be one way or another, is kind of really instructive, I think. And I would, but just say in terms of when did it end, I would say certainly in the kind of post-imperial successor states, there's a period up until probably 1950 when those ambiguities were being slowly ironed out or reinforced. But then I would say even, you know, in the post-war period, the beginning of kind of post-war communist Eastern Europe, with the elimination of Greek Catholicism in many contexts, which is another body of scholarship that chooses to use this liminality, the question of liminality, that I can see that, you know, even into the 50s, we still have these kind of problems worked out where communities can be, you know, ethnically different and yet, you know, contained within the same church or, you know, in different churches, but kind of interacting across religious boundaries in certain locations, for example, pilgrimage sites that serve different religious communities and allow communities to enter into a space where they can live their ambiguities when perhaps at home they can't. They can go somewhere to live them. And those kind of sites, I think there's an emerging body of scholarship on some of the Ukrainian, Polish borderland, kind of Hungarian and subcarpathian region, Hungary, Romania, where we see that you know, despite seemingly very, very powerful national discourses or church identities, that certain sites of ambiguity can persist, but who knows until who knows when. Yeah.
Yeah, I guess, you know, what James Kapala suggests, that, you know, it's very much how to say, you know, fluid and circumstantial, and we just need to look both across time and geography and take into account the role of the state, and I think also, you know, discussing different regimes, like, you know, the communist regime is opposed to other forms of political power, of course, had its own specificity, and I find that, you know, research of your group in particular is extremely valuable, because this is like we don't really have the full picture, you know, of this life in the communist country, religious life in the communist countries, because of the lack of evidence. And now, with the archives being open in some places like Romania and Ukraine, you know, the picture is just incredible. Like you do see this, you know, very, very well developed religious underground, and I find that we don't still have apparatus how to, you know, how to understand, how to, you know, describe this phenomenon. So I think there is quite a lot there, you know, even to for the future PhD students. So David, you have a lot to research. It's a really very vibrant field, you know, this religious studies in you know, in these territories. And yeah, well, sorry, Andrei, I'm taking your role now, so you should moderate and see, you know, we already like, you know.
We can see that Eugene would
Yeah,
like to react, please.
So, yeah, I wonder if ambiguity can ever be eliminated. It seems like always at the borders of any, once you set a border, then you're always negotiating that border. So I'm living in the United States, where, you know, in Texas, the governor has just declared that there's an invasion, and so should give him ability to fortify the border in all kinds of different ways, just thinking about this kind of physical border, it's can be imagined between the United States and Mexico, for example. It can be imagined in many different ways. Of course, it was much more porous earlier, you know, a century ago than it is. Than it is trying to be now, right? So it's but once you decide, I mean, the Innocentites, they're very an interesting group, because of course they claim to be Orthodox, and it's authorities who say they're not, right? So it's there are many groups actually like this, and one can think that it seems to me like ambiguity, certainly in the religious context and maybe in the national context, is often somewhere. I mean, you can never really get rid of it without violence, right? Without some kind of state power or other kind of authoritative power exercise to try to eliminate that ambiguity. So, and it seems to me like it's always being renegotiated. It's kind of the human condition. So, I guess the question is, where is it? You know, where is the ambiguity? And I'm thinking an example from the Russian case is the in 1906 Russian religious law changes and Article 96 specifically targets castration, fanaticism, and immorality as the three kind of characteristics of bad religion that needs to be prosecuted. And that, of course, many of the people who were prosecuted under the Article 96 claimed that they were Orthodox when the state was claiming that they weren't. And that, of course, that region of ambiguity had an enormous personal, was an enormous personal tragedy for those people who ended up being exiled or imprisoned under that article. So I think, I think ambiguity is still with us.
Thank you, Eugene. Maybe somebody else would like to say something or to conclude. Maybe somebody of editors of this forum would like to conclude our discussion. Irina.
I mean, I do hope that we are not we are not depriving people of the chance to speak. It seems like, some people in North America just woke up and, they're now ready to get into discussion, and we are going to finish because it's time for dinner in our part of the world. But yeah, let's just try to come back to the beginning, because we started from National Indifference, and I thought I would like to say something which Peter Judson wrote to us when we forwarded him our introduction, and he made really interesting comments. And what he said was that the whole concept was to develop a strategy that would help us to get out of an unfruitful intellectual situation at the time, almost 20 years ago, a situation that clearly no longer exists. And for that reason, the term as such may have outlived its usefulness. I think this is a perfect example of intellectual humility, where somebody who is like the father of the term or one of the creators of this concept recognizes that it might have outlived its usefulness. So, and as we just started to discuss towards the end of our discussion, that there are so many other ways in which we can address this, concrete empirical, studies. I mean, how can we analyze empirical studies through these concepts of ambiguity or borders or liminality or hybridity? So I think we have like a very rich menu of different concepts, and in fact, in our introduction, we deal with many of those, and there is a very good survey of historiography, including very recent ones. So please dig into it. I think you might find it useful and recommend it to your students. But I do feel very, very inspired by our discussion today, and I think religion, as I said in my Facebook post, religion may have seen like a little bit of a frontier or borderland of certain ways of looking at things. It's like, politics first, economy second, or maybe the other way around, and then other issues, society, and then maybe religion. So, but I think what we are trying to do is kind of to look from religion as a center and address these kind of bigger issues like, politics and identity and nationalism. So I think there is quite a lot of potential for further collaboration and further collective and individual work. So I just want to thank once again everybody who came today to spend, this couple of hours with us. And yeah, so look forward to our future work.
Thank you, and I would like also to thank you all for this interesting presentation of the special forum and your reactions and comments and this discussion. Here I think we should finish and to move to maybe informal part, formal conversation.